Good afternoon. Good to have all of you live and remotely for day 3 of Joshua and the Law of Influence. So with that, we got a lot to cover today, so we'll jump right in to our time today. We're talking again about the Law of Influence, and the Law of Influence is the true measure of leadership is influence, nothing more and nothing less. So once again, we have a leadership thought for every day. If you remember from yesterday, the leadership thought was when a leader has little influence, little can be accomplished. Today you ought to feel much better about it, because today we're going to look at the opposite of that, which then means that our leadership thought for today is that when a leader has much influence, much can be accomplished. And so to introduce our time together today, let's talk a little bit about Joshua's leadership development. John Maxwell writes on page 25 of our book, The 21 Most Powerful Minutes on a Leader's Day, how was Joshua, once a tribal leader, incapable of persuading the people, transformed into a leader, able to take the children of Israel into the land promised to their forefathers? Why did his influence grow so much? Let me read that one more time. How was Joshua, once a tribal leader, incapable of persuading the people, transformed into a leader, able to take the children of Israel into the land promised to their forefathers? Why did his influence grow so much? There are two basic reasons for this, and we'll jump into both of them in more detail. Joshua's influence grew first because he was right, and second because of his relationship with Moses, who was his long-term mentor. So let's look more deeply into this issue because he was right. There are 5 components to this part of the equation. The first is that Joshua was a man of prayer. It says about Joshua in the book of Exodus in chapter 33 that Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. And that's really impressive in the sense that Joshua could have been tempted to kind of ride on Moses's spiritual coattails, if you will, but he chose instead to develop his own relationship with God. And he cultivated that by spending time in prayer, being in the tabernacle in the presence of God. And so he didn't have to use Moses as an intermediary between himself and God, but he developed his own personal relationship with God, as I said, rather than riding on Moses' spiritual coattails. So in addition to prayer, then we turn to the issue of obedience. Joshua modeled a life of obedience to God that remained consistent. And what I really like about this, and this stands out as opposed to Saul from last week, even as he took on roles of greater magnitude. So you think about when Joshua started, he was basically Moses' assistant, his water boy, if you will, just doing menial things for Moses. But then he became a warrior, and then finally the acknowledged leader of Israel, and everyone followed him. Now, I love this statement by Oswald Chambers in regard to obedience. I think it's very powerful. It says, never try to explain God until you've obeyed him. The only part of God we truly understand is the part that we have obeyed. Wow, that's pretty powerful, that we don't really know him except for that which we have obeyed ourselves. So prayer, obedience, and now let's talk briefly about the subject of faith. Joshua displayed great courage, first when he stood up along with Caleb against the other 10 spies who brought about the bad report. how easy it might have been to just go along, get along to go along, go along to get along, go with the flow, just to make peace, and because there were 10 of them, and just him and Caleb. We find that going back into the book of Numbers in chapter 14, the people actually conspired to stone Joshua and Caleb because they actually have the audacity to believe God at his word. Then another time was when Joshua was fighting the Amalekites. Another opportunity when he went up against the Amalekites, even though they had far greater numbers than he did. So Joshua consistently led a life of courage. So he was not the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz. What is courage? Or should I say courage? It is faith in action. Joshua combined these two elements, obedience and faith, and it produced the following equation. Maybe you didn't think you'd get math in here, but today we have a mathematical, quote unquote, equation, and here it is. Take some time and digest this. Courage plus obedience today equals success tomorrow. Let me read that one more time. Courage, or faith in action, plus obedience today equals success tomorrow. So we can leverage those two things, obedience and faith, together in order to promote success in the future. And then you've probably heard this statement in regard to faith, but it bears repeating. God puts no limitations on faith, and faith puts no limitations on God. So we talked about prayer, we talked about obedience, we talked about faith, and now let's talk briefly about the issue of commitment. As I just mentioned earlier, Joshua fought in battles where he was vastly outnumbered. He continued to stand up to those who wanted to stone him, always standing up for what God said rather than what they were saying. How easy it would have been just to, as I mentioned before, just taking the popular way or the easy way. But instead, he took God's way, even at his own personal harm. So he continued to make stands when he needed to make stands. And then finally, he gave his best for what he believed in. If something's worth doing, it truly is worth doing right, and it truly is worthy of our best effort. And that's exactly what Joshua did. And then the last component of this issue, this side of the equation, that Joshua was right, deals with the subject of partnership. Let's look at that for just a minute. Joshua partnered first and foremost with God on the mission to conquer the land of Canaan. Now, the greatest example of that would undoubtedly be the one we probably know the most about, and that, of course, is the Battle of Jericho. Now, I would venture to say that probably no other military general ever came up with the idea of walking around a city, blowing horns as you're walking, and doing that 6 days in a row, and then on the seventh day, doing it 7 times, and then shouting. I don't think most military geniuses would have come up with that kind of strategy. In fact, I could almost imagine Joshua, when he first heard God tell him that, thinking, are you serious? You want us to walk around this place, blowing horns and praising you, and then we're just going to believe that when we shout, the walls are just going to fall down? You expect us to believe that? Well, not only did God expect him to believe it, but he did, and they did, and the wall fell. So Joshua partnered with God first and foremost, but he also, and I'll use this kind of in quotes here, partnered with his character. And what I mean by that specifically is that he valued what was right over what was popular. And again, that cannot be overemphasized. To do the right thing is the right thing. Sometimes it's much easier to do the popular thing, but we build confidence in ourselves. We build respect from other people when we do the right thing, and especially when the right thing is not the popular thing. And so that provided a strong foundation upon which to build greater influence. So we've taken some time and we've looked at the issue of Joshua being right, but he also grew in influence on account of his relationship with Moses. Moses, as you may recall, was the unquestioned leader of Israel for over 40 years. And the people followed with some exceptions, but generally speaking, when Moses spoke, they listened and responded. And so Joshua became Moses' assistant first and foremost, but then Moses became Joshua's mentor. And there came a time when Joshua then went and spent all of his time with Moses. In fact, wherever Moses went, guess where you'd find Joshua? Right next door to him, right there with him. Can you imagine the kind of conversations they must have had after God parted the Red Sea, when God provided the pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night, all the miracles, when Joshua went up on the mountain to get the 10 commandments from God? All these things, Joshua was there. And so he learned by not only what Moses taught him, but he was close enough to see his example. What a great application for us, that those that we are mentoring have to be able to not just hear from us, but see us in action so that we can model that, what we want them to do. So the mentoring relationship then continued throughout the entire 40 years of Israel's desert wanderings. Think about this, that Israel was in the desert for 40 years, and basically only 3 people made it through the entire time: Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. No one else made it except for the children below 20 years of age. And so that was a long time in the desert for Joshua to grow in influence and to learn from Moses the things that Moses had learned from God. And then at God's direction, when the time was right, which was, of course, when Moses' time was drawing to a close, Moses publicly, and that's an important thing, in the sight of all Israel, Moses publicly imparted his authority to Joshua to succeed him as the leader of Israel. God had spoken to Moses after Moses had sinned, and God had told him that he wasn't going to be able to go into the promised land. He would be allowed to see it from a distance as he climbed the mountain. But God said, you're not going to go in there. God told him Joshua is the one who will lead the people into Canaan. And so Moses publicly, if you will, commissioned Joshua in front of all the people. And that undoubtedly lent great authority to Joshua. In fact, the people at that point in time then declared that they had obeyed Moses, so they would now obey Joshua. And so that brings us to our conclusion this afternoon. Preacher and writer A.W. Tozer said, God is looking for people through whom he can do the impossible. What a pity that we plan only the things that we can do by ourselves. Wow. Doesn't take much faith to do what we can do ourselves. Faith comes into play when we're stretched beyond what we can do ourselves. And that's the kind of people that God is looking for, who will do the impossible, partnering, of course, with God. Crossing over into the promised land and conquering its people was a humanly impossible task. Yet Joshua was willing to take on that challenge. And by the time he got his second chance, oh, thank God for second chances. By the time he got his second chance to do it, he had enough influence with the people to take them along. And that's from 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day, pages 27 and 28. This will bring us to our question for reflection before we leave today. And it's a positive question today, just like our leadership thought. In what areas are you accomplishing much through your influence? Yesterday it was, what aren't you accomplishing in areas that you want to be? Today we turn that around and invite you and encourage you to ask yourself, in what areas are you accomplishing much through your influence? Thank you for joining us today and every day. We look forward to being with you on this journey, and look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, whether in person or remotely. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of the day.